Tonight what we're going to look at is Bible prophecy. We're going to start down the track of Bible prophecy. And why is this so important? It's because if you jump to the end of the Bible, it talks about a thing called the mark of the beast. What is the mark of the beast? And I will put to you that if you jump into the book of Revelation and try to understand what the mark of the beast, you're sort of starting at the wrong end. You've got to go back in the Bible, back to the Old Testament, and work your way up through prophecy. God is very logical in what he does. And so what we're going to look at tonight is not the mark of the beast per se, but we're going to lay a foundation of how to understand Bible prophecy very simply and clearly so we can build towards understanding this. If we don't, you can fall into all sorts of traps, and there's speculation out there and all sorts. We want to make it really, really simple. Some people wonder, is it a barcode on a grocery thing? Is it a credit card? These are all the speculations that have been put forward. What about an ID card? Is it some sort of chip implanted in the forehead? None of this. Here's the Bible verses talks about it. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark in their right hand or on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Very important to understand. So we're not going to go there just tonight. We're going to start laying a groundwork to understand this from a biblical point of view. And how do we know we can trust Bible prophecy? Here in Isaiah, God spells out an attribute that no other so-called God has. There were many gods, of course, back in the Old Testament, made of stone and wood, and people used to bow down to them. But God puts a challenge out to all these false gods. In Isaiah, he says, I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done. And that's the challenge that God himself lays down, saying, all these false gods, they don't know the future, but I do, and I can reveal that. And in fact, if you come to Matthew chapter 24, Jesus pointed us back to Bible prophecy. One time he said, I tell you before it come, that when it has come to pass, you may believe that I am he. So Jesus himself, very important point here, Jesus himself spoke about what Daniel the prophet talked about. And he says, whoever reads, let him understand. Does that mean we can understand the prophecies of Daniel? Absolutely. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. Some of the prophecies in Daniel, which lays the groundwork for properly understanding Revelation. Now the setting of Daniel was back when Solomon's temple was destroyed. Remember, the Babylonian army came down, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple that Solomon had built a number of hundred years before that, and took back to Babylon a lot of captives. And the writer of the book of Daniel was one of these captives. We're talking the year around about 606 to 605 BC. We're going to the city of Babylon, and we can look at Daniel, who was bought as a captive. He was appointed to be a wise man. Ultimately, through providence, he became the prime minister, and then God used him as a prophet. So we're going to have a look at some interesting stories in Babylon. First of all, have a look at the city of Babylon itself. It used to be the most magnificent city in the whole world at one time. It must have been absolutely glorious to have been there. You've probably heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, very famous landmark from history. Of course, they're all destroyed now. Babylon was actually quite large. Records tell us that it was 10 miles or 16 kilometers in circumference. And that was bigger than Rome ever was, or Athens. So it was a very large city for its time. There was a big temple there called the Temple of Marduk, which was 391 meters high, very high for its time. And outside it was covered with blue glazed tiles, and inside there was a whole lot of gold. In fact, history tells us there was a throne inside this temple made from 8.5 tons of solid gold. And Babylon was known for the abundance of gold. And you'll see how significant that is tonight. And yet at the height of its glory, height of its power, the prophets of God in Israel were getting messages from God to say this: Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It never shall be inhabited. Sorry about my craggy throat there. And another prophet, Jeremiah, wrote, Babylon shall become heaps without an inhabitant. Now, when this was said, this sounded so unreasonable. Here was Babylon at the height of its power, and these prophets are saying one day it's going to become like Sodom and Gomorrah, uninhabited. Well, if you go to Babylon today, notice that word, Babylon shall become heaps. What does heaps conjure up in your mind? Well, if you go to Babylon today, what do you find? You find literally heaps of old bricks making up the ruins. Here's some of the shots of these heaps of bricks. Does that sound like the prophecy was very accurate? Exactly, it was bang on. And some of these bricks have inscriptions, and some of them actually include Nebuchadnezzar by name. Very interesting. Now, during the time of Saddam Hussein, they started to restore a little bit of these ruins. Here's the Ishtar Gate, which they've put together, but actually that's not the original. The original Ishtar Gate is not here at all. It was taken away by archaeologists back in the 1800s, way back to Germany, and you can go and see the original Ishtar Gate from Babylon in the Pergamon Museum. And here it is inside the museum. They've reconstructed it, literally tile by tile. They took the tiles off and numbered them, shipped them back, and reconstructed the Ishtar Gate from Babylon here in this museum. And you can go and see this today. And one interesting thing, all the lions they've got, when they rebuilt this gate and the walls around it, you can see these lions here. A lot of them, 120 of them, and you'll see why that's significant in a little while. And actually, back in the ruins of Babylon, they found statues of lions. Here's a statue of a lion, a bit broken, it's been damaged, crouching over this human figure here. Interesting. So a lion was a symbol that Babylon used for itself. Now in the background you can see one of the buildings, one of the palaces so-called, that Saddam Hussein built. You may recall Saddam Hussein. He attempted to rebuild the old city of Babylon. He wanted to reconstruct it. And some of the billboards and posters he put up shows himself next to Nebuchadnezzar. He saw himself as in the line of Nebuchadnezzar. You remember Nebuchadnezzar came down and conquered Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem and took people captive. You may recall that Saddam Hussein fired missiles towards Israel. Do you remember that during the Gulf War? He obviously had the same aims to conquer Israel. This is one of the palaces that Saddam Hussein built around the site. And you can see this is taken from a US Army helicopter when they used that for a little while. And this is around the ruins of Babylon. Some of the artwork in Iraq showed Saddam Hussein as a modern-day Nebuchadnezzar. Here's Saddam riding a chariot, conquering, except he's got some modern aeroplanes and helicopters there, not just a chariot. And one of the units in the Iraqi National Guard was called the Nebuchadnezzar unit. But of course he wasn't successful. Even though he tried to rebuild parts of Babylon, you can see part of the reconstruction here, it never got very far and he was removed from power. In fact, here's a shot from there. You can see the area that they restored. But again, it was never inhabited, just like the Bible said. And of course the American army came in and removed him from power. Now we're going to have a look at a prophecy that was given in this city nearly 2,600 years ago, way back in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. And here's what the Bible had to say. In the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. And his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. So he had this very vivid dream. He must have woken up and thought, wow, that's really important, but I can't remember the details. So what he did was, he called all his wise men together, and he had this challenge for them. And of course they say, O king, live forever, tell us your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. Or they think, well, we could probably make something up that sounds good and very flattering. What did Nebuchadnezzar think of this? He was going to challenge these guys because these wise men claimed to know the future. They claimed to have connections with the gods. So he said, you tell me the dream, you tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll know that you can give its interpretation. That was the challenge he laid down to these wise men. And they thought, wow, We can't do that. You tell us the dream, king, and we'll tell you what it means. He said, no, you tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll know you can give me the interpretation. And their response was, there's no man on earth who can do what you ask. And Nebuchadnezzar was furious. He must have been suspecting these guys weren't entirely honest or something, but he said, right, kill a lot of them. Pretty rash sort of guy, Nebuchadnezzar, obviously. Now, amongst the wise men, although not there at the time, but included in that group, was Daniel and his friends. And when they heard about this decree to kill all the wise men, he asked for some time. He said, give us some time. And they went to prayer. He and his friends prayed. And what happened? God answered the prayer and gave Daniel the same dream. And the first thing we read in the Bible is he thanked and praised God for that. He says, I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demands. And he went back to Nebuchadnezzar, young Daniel. He didn't take the glory to himself. He said, there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. He gave all glory to God. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Notice that. In other words, in the future, right down to the end. And then he describes what Nebuchadnezzar has seen in his dream. And Nebuchadnezzar must have been thinking, yes, that's exactly what I saw. Must have all been coming back to him as Daniel described it. It says, you, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you. Its form was awesome. And then he describes in detail this big image. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Must have been pretty awesome. We've got some artist pictures of what that may have looked like coming up. We don't know exactly, but we can begin to get a picture in our minds. And then something else happened. It says, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, we don't know exactly what this looks like. We've got a little animation. Is it ready to go? Okay, we've got a little tiny animation coming up which shows one artist's concept of what this may have looked like. You'll see this big metal image and you'll hear the Bible verses overlaid on the animation.
Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king.
So that was a quick summary, visually, of what he saw. And you notice he ended up saying, this is the dream, now we'll tell the interpretation of it before the king. So let's go through what Daniel explains to Nebuchadnezzar, that this image, you can see what the artist has drawn here, an impression of it. Let's see what it all means. First thing he says was, you, O king, are a king of kings, you are this head of gold. So this gold head on this image represents Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. So obviously this gold head here represents the Babylonian kingdom with Nebuchadnezzar as its king. And here's a little map showing with the area and the time that it ruled until. Here's a larger map showing the area that Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon, covered. Based down here in what we call Iraq today. It's about 80 kilometers from the capital of Iraq, Baghdad. And you'll see how they conquered down to the land of Palestine, Israel. So there's the kingdom of Babylon. Well, that's the gold head. What about the chest and arms of a different metal? What did Daniel say? Its chest and arms were of silver. So what is this? He said, but after you shall arise another kingdom, notice that, inferior to yours. Now, what was the kingdom that came after Babylon? Sorry, this is not a history exam. Basically, it was the Persian, or some cases they call it the Medo-Persian, because it was the Medes and the Persians were an alliance. And you'll see more of this as we go through tonight. So the kingdom that conquered or took over the area of Babylon was Persia. It became the Medo-Persian Empire from 539 up to about 1331 BC. And here's a map where that covered. They came from Persia, over here, which we call Iran today, across and conquered all of Babylon and down even further into the top of Africa and right across what we call Turkey today. And here's some bits from archaeology. Here's a relief of a Persian warrior. And actually, what's quite intriguing is the Bible actually predicted how the Persians would conquer the Babylonians. Quite intriguing. In fact, I'll show you some of the verses on that. Here it is here in Jeremiah. It says, the word that the Lord spake against Babylon, a drought is upon her waters, and they shall be dried up. Jeremiah chapter 50. The river Euphrates ran through the city of Babylon. And here God was predicting in prophecy how that would be used to conquer the city of Babylon. And it's even intriguing that God spells out the name of the Persian general who would do this. In Isaiah chapter 45, thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held to subdue nations before him, and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut. Now this is quite intriguing. Right at the time when this was happening, what were the Babylonians doing inside the city? You can read the whole story in Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar, the king, he was the king of Babylon, had a great feast. And what they did is they bought the vessels, it says, this is straight out of Daniel chapter 5, they bought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. When the Babylonians came and conquered Jerusalem, they took a lot of the vessels back to Babylon. And here's Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, having this party, if you like, and he says, let's go and get the nice gold cups we got from the temple out of Jerusalem. And they started drinking out of those. And then suddenly something happened. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall. Have you heard the expression, the writing is on the wall? That's where this comes from. A hand appeared and wrote an inscription upon the wall. And this really frightened Belshazzar, and no one could understand it. And they called all the wise men and they said, we don't know. Then someone said, Daniel, the old man, he might know. They brought him in, and Daniel interpreted this writing on the wall. And the last part of it says, thy kingdom, speaking to Belshazzar, is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And right at that time, Cyrus was outside the city walls doing something to get into the city. And the Bible goes on to say that that night Belshazzar, the king of Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Median took over the kingdom. So Darius the Mede took the kingdom, and his general, the Persian general, was doing something outside the walls. This is what we can read from history. This is well known. Cyrus, who was the Persian general, had the Euphrates River diverted so his army could enter Babylon via the river gates and the wall. Where the river flowed through the city, they had big gates, and then along the shores, the walls, or what do you call it, the barrier of the river, where they had walls along there, they had gates and that, and those were left open. And Herodotus, the historian, says the water level dropped because they diverted into a big area they had prepared for this. And the water level dropped down to the height of the middle of a man's thigh. So literally the army waded up through this now shallow river, through the gates which were left open, according to Bible prophecy, and they went in and conquered the city. Now, what's quite amazing is that event was predicted here in Isaiah. It says, I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the two-leaved gates. And this is what God was saying about Cyrus. Now, this was written 150 years before Cyrus was even born. Can you imagine that? Imagine if you found an old letter from 150 years ago, back in the 1800s, and it mentioned you by name and what you'd be doing today. Wouldn't you be amazed? Well, here's Cyrus mentioned by name 150 years even before he was born, and describing how he would conquer the city of Babylon. Amazing. Later, after Darius died, Cyrus became the ruler. But anyway, let's carry on with this vision in Daniel chapter 2. After the arms of silver, the Medes and Persians, it says, then a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. So which kingdom came after the Medo-Persians? Don't worry, not a trick question. It's the kingdom of Greece. Remember, Alexander the Great came down and conquered literally all that Medo-Persian territory. Here's a map. What happened was the Medo-Persians, when they conquered all the way across Turkey up to Greece, which is over here, and they tried to invade Greece, Alexander the Great must have been so annoyed at that, he took his armies all the way across and literally destroyed the Medo-Persian Empire and conquered their whole territory, and even conquered some more ground. And of course, Alexander the Great, amazing guy from history, very, very skilled general. He conquered that area so rapidly in about 8 years. Here's a bust of what he looked like. Very clever guy. When they got to India, because they got as far as India, you can see on the map, the Indians brought out elephants to battle with Alexander the Great. But do you know what he did to conquer those? Apparently elephants don't like pigs. And so Alexander the Great had herds of pigs, which he let loose amongst the elephants, and that panicked them, and he was able to conquer these armies. These are some of the tricks that he used. Quite amazing. Now, what about the legs of iron, this next kingdom? It says, the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron. Who was the iron kingdom? Rome, yes, exactly. You guys know. And this is well known from history. The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. The images of gold, silver, or brass that might serve to represent the nations and their kings were successively broken by the iron monarchy of Rome. Rome was known for its iron weapons. And that rule, that conquered all that territory, 168, and ruled up until it was broken up. So there's the area occupied by Rome. You can see there's a move towards the west gradually. These kingdoms are slowly moving towards the west. So all of Europe was occupied by the Romans right up to Hadrian's Wall here. And it was during the time of the Roman occupation that a lot of the New Testament was written. Baby Jesus was born, of course. Jesus was crucified by Roman soldiers. Rome was a very powerful nation, went conquering. Very, very powerful nation, but prophecy had predicted something. What happened to the Roman Empire? Well, history tells us, around about AD 365, it says, as if trumpets were sounding the war note throughout the whole Roman world, the most savage peoples roused themselves and poured across the nearest frontiers. All up in the north were tribes which the Romans hadn't conquered, and these came literally charging down from the north and broke up the Roman Empire. And round about by 476 AD, that Roman Empire had been broken up and divided into about 10 kingdoms by these tribes that came down. Now you'd logically think, you had this statue with gold, silver, brass, iron, you'd think, well, there's 4. Who's going to be the 5th? Isn't there going to be number 5? Well, no. What did the prophecy say? What happened to that iron? Did it change into something else? No, it got mingled with something here, became iron and clay. It says, just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. And the Roman Empire, we know from history, was broken up. These tribes came down. And here's a list of them here. You're probably familiar with quite a few of these. The Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, the Burgundians. And where these tribes settled became loosely what are the nations of Europe today. Like, where did the Anglo-Saxons settle? Basically, they took over England, didn't they? And the Franks became the French, the Burgundians became the Swiss. And you can match these tribes with the different nations of Europe today. Some of them, though, disappeared. The Heruli was one of these tribes, the Vandals and the Ostrogoths. Now, you've probably heard of Vandals today, because apparently this tribe was very destructive in what they did. And there are Vandals today, but they're not quite descendants from those. But these tribes here disappeared, and we'll look at more of that on another evening, because that's quite intriguing, what happened to those. Now, it's interesting that when this kingdom was divided, the Bible here says, this is King James, but we'll unpack this a little bit. It says, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave, which means unite one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Now this phrase here, which is translated mingling themselves with the seed of men, literally means intermarry. Literally means intermarriage. Now what is this talking about here? Was this fulfilled in these divided kingdoms? And the answer is yes, quite remarkably. If you come down to the time, this is a quote from Wikipedia, Queen Victoria was nicknamed the grandmother of Europe. What they tried to do is they tried to unite Europe by having all the royal families intermarry. And there was a point, it says, in fact this is quite intriguing, at the time of the outbreak of the First World War, their grandchildren, this is talking about Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom and Christian IX, the King of Denmark, it says their grandchildren occupied the thrones of Denmark, Greece, Norway, Germany, Romania, Russia, Spain and the United Kingdom. Just about all of Europe were united because their monarchs, the head of state, were intermarried and related to each other. It's like they're all cousins and nephews and uncles. That was how they tried to unite Europe. Unfortunately, though, did it work? Was Europe united? If anything, it became very war-torn, wasn't it? What happened around about World War I, where you had Kaiser Wilhelm trying to unite Europe through military power? You had World War I. What happened in 1939? Does anyone recognise this gentleman here? Adolf Hitler, yes, he had a very good go at it. In fact, all through history there's been different leaders. Napoleon tried to unite Europe under what? The French power. And he failed. He got all the way up to Russia. He'd conquered a huge amount of Europe, but then he was defeated. And this has been the story because the Bible said they shall not cleave one to another. We think about Hitler. He probably had the best go at it. He had an army of 5 million soldiers, huge army, very powerful, marched across Europe unopposed, and for a long time it looked like he was going to win. He'd conquered France, Belgium, all up into Norway. He was conquering down to Greece, Malta, etc. He looked unstoppable. But you know, right about this time, some magazines were coming out, like this one here, Signs of the Times. And do you recognise this thing here? And they asked the question, will one power rule the world? It looked like it was going to happen. Germany was going to conquer Europe. Japan was fighting America in the Pacific. It looked pretty grim for the world. But people who published this said Hitler would never unite Europe under Germany. Now, how could they say that? In fact, there were speakers going around. This guy here, he's long since passed away, but he was speaking. Here we are, look at this, King George Theatre in Lower Hutt. And he was going to talk about Hitler's hopes are doomed. One Bible phrase of 5 words wrecked the dream of Napoleon and drove the Kaiser to exile. These 5 prophetic words will meet Hitler and Goering, and they shall not pass. And they used to have big meetings. Here's a meeting in Lower Hutt. Thousands of people come along to hear. And what were those 5 words? They shall not cleave one to another. In other words, Europe would never get back together again. And was he right? Were they right in saying this from Bible prophecy? Absolutely. Hitler failed, didn't he? He got close to it, but then the tide of the war turned and he failed once again. You know what's intriguing is only the Bible contains Bible prophecy like that. You can look at other so-called writings, whether it be the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita and so forth. Nothing has prophecy like the Bible. Almost a third of the Bible is prophecy. Quite amazing. But remember, this vision, this dream we just looked at, didn't finish with just that. What was the next thing that took place? And has this happened yet? Remember, it went on to say, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands. That means by divine power, is what that means. Which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And what's this referring to? The explanation is given real plain in verse 44. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. There it is. Has that happened yet? Not yet, but it's the next major thing due to happen according to this prophecy. Now, is this interpretation we've just shared, is this something new or radical? Not at all. You go back to the reformers like Martin Luther. This has been known for a long time. It says the first kingdom is the Assyrian or Babylonian kingdom. The second is the Medo-Persian. The third is the great kingdom of Alexander and the Greeks. The fourth, the Roman Empire. And this, the whole world agrees, and history supports it fully in detail. But notice what he went on to say. The prophet has most to say about the Roman Empire, the legs, the feet, and the toes. The Roman Empire will be divided. Spain, France, England, and others emerged from it, some of them weak, others strong. And although it will be divided, there will be some strength, as symbolized by the iron in it. This empire shall last until the end. No one will destroy it but Jesus himself when his kingdom comes. So this interpretation has been known about for a long time. It's very clear from history. So here's the summary. That head of gold there was Babylon. And it's quite plain from the Bible. Thou art this head of gold, Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar. The next one was Medo-Persia. And you can see in chapter 5 that the writing on the wall said to the king of Babylon at the time, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So the Medes and the Persians were the next kingdom. Then Greece was conquered Medo-Persia. And we can look at that in Daniel chapter 8. We'll look at that briefly in a second. Then came Rome. How do we know Rome was in control? Because at the time of Jesus, all the world would be taxed according to Caesar. So Caesar had control, the Caesar of Rome. And it was during this time that Jesus came. Now, some have proposed that that stone coming down, this stone coming down and smiting the image, was that Jesus setting up his kingdom at his first coming 2,000 years ago. Some put that forward. But I'll put to you that doesn't quite match the prophecy. I'll back up for a second, because when Jesus came, had the Roman Empire been broken up into these tribes that came down from northern Europe? And the answer is no. That didn't happen until a long time after Jesus' time. When Jesus was crucified, the Roman Empire was still at its strongest. So that stone coming down and smiting the feet wasn't Jesus' first coming. It's going to be his second coming. Does that make sense? And that's when he'll destroy all those kingdoms. So here comes the stone, which represents the second coming of Jesus. And we can read this in Revelation. There were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So there's a summary. We just had a quick look at what this Daniel chapter 2 image represents. Now, Daniel's an interesting book. Here's a chart, and we won't go into all the details. It has this kind of like mirror-like thing. Essentially, what happens as you go through the book of Daniel, when you come to another vision, like Daniel chapter 7, it gives different beasts. But this is essentially repeating the same ground here, but giving more details. And this is how Bible prophecy works. It builds up. You come to chapter 8, and again it repeats some of these details, but gives more information. So the Bible works on a principle of repeat and enlarge. Daniel 2, which we've just looked at, that big metal image, is repeated, different symbols, but the same ground is covered, and you can start to join the dots. You can compare this bit with this bit and fill out all the details. And that's how Bible prophecy works. So let's have a look quickly now at Daniel chapter 7, and also a little bits from Daniel 8, and you'll see how they parallel very, very nicely. Here's the prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matter. So here's Daniel being given this dream, and he writes it out for us in chapter 7. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, behold, the four winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. So do you hear that? The wind is blowing on the water, stirring it up, and out of that stirred up water come these four beasts, all different from each other. Now what do winds represent? This is obviously a symbol. And if you let the Bible explain itself, it explains here that winds represent war and strife, turmoil, if you like, of nations. Here's an example, and Jeremiah talks about, upon Elam will I bring the four winds, here it is, from the four quarters of heaven, and I will scatter them towards all those winds, and there shall be no nation whither the outcasts of Elam shall not come. So here's this nation of Elam getting broken up. And what does it mean? For I will cause Elam to be dismayed before their enemies. I will send the sword after them till I have consumed them. So essentially this country was conquered, this invasion with armies. And that's symbolized by the winds. Do you follow that? So wind blowing on the sea represents war and strife. Does that make sense? Now, what about these beasts coming up? What do these beasts represent? And again, the explanation is given real plain, so we don't have to guess here. Those great beasts, which are four kings which arise out of the earth. Very simple, isn't it? And another verse says, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon earth. So what's the solution? What is a beast in Bible prophecy here? Quite plain, isn't it? It's a king or a kingdom. Does that make sense? So let's have a look at these four beasts that came up. Verse 4 brings the first one. The first was like a lion, but this is no normal lion. He had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. So here's this lion, but no normal lion. It's got wings of an eagle, and it's being given a man's heart. Interesting. What's the second beast? I beheld another beast, a second like a bear, and it raised up itself on one side. So this is a lopsided bear. And it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise and devour much flesh. What came after that? After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard. But this is no normal leopard. Have a look at this. Which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. And the beast also had 4 heads. And dominion was given to it. So these are not normal animals that you'll see in a zoo. These are prophetic animals. And lastly, after this I saw in the night visions, behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible. Now, it doesn't describe what this is. It doesn't say it was an elephant or a hippopotamus. If you follow through, it's actually a dragon. You can figure that out from Revelation. And so the artist has drawn it like a dinosaur. It says, and strong exceedingly, it had great iron teeth. Notice that. The teeth were made of iron. And it devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it. It was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So this was different from the other ones. It had 10 horns. So let's go through these beasts that we just saw in the video and see if we can unpack some of these things. First of all, this lion, you might have seen it had 2 big wings. What do wings represent in Bible prophecy? Well, here's a clue from Samuel and Habakkuk. It talks about swifter than eagles, and they were stronger than lions. Wings are a symbol of speed, aren't they? So and Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, conquered quite quickly. What about the man's heart? There's an interesting story in the book of Daniel about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, where he exalted himself, and then he was humbled by God. Quite intriguing. So who's this lion? Well, it's interesting. In Jeremiah was around about the time of the Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem. He said, "The lion has come up from his thicket, and the destroyer of nations is on his way. And his chariot's like a whirlwind, his horses are swifter than eagles." Who's that talking about? He went on to say, "Israel is a scattered sheep. The lions have driven him away. This Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, hath broken his bones." You remember what happened at the time of the Babylonian invasion when they destroyed Solomon's temple, took Daniel and his friends captive back to Babylon? Who was the lion according to Jeremiah? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Another one says, "The king of Babylon shall come up like a lion," and there's the references, you can look those up. And it's interesting that the lion was what the Babylonians used themselves as their own symbol. Here's one of those lions on that wall, the Ishtar Gate, that was put together in the museum. And here's a quote, Excavations at Babylon, by one of the archaeologists here. He said, "The lion, the animal of Ishtar, was so favourite a subject at all times in Babylonian art," in other words, they use it all over the place, "that its rich and lavish employment at the main gate of Babylon, the Ishtar Gate, is by no means abnormal." In other words, they used lions everywhere. They loved the lion. So God used the lion to symbolize Babylon because the Babylonians themselves liked to use a lion to symbolize themselves. Here's the ruins of Babylon, and here's a statue that was found in the ruins. Here it is. And what is it? It's a lion crouching over a prone man as if it's just conquered him or knocked him down. And there's another one. There's more than one of these found. The person underneath. Now, what about the next beast? So if the lion represents Babylon, who do you think the bear that comes up next represent? Remember we saw in the Bible, the kingdom of Babylon was divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So who would logically this next beast be? Medo-Persia. Does that make sense? Notice the bear, it said, was raised up on one side. This was a coalition between the Medes and the Persians. And the Persians were more powerful. The Medes came first, but the Persians took control later, and they were the more powerful of them. And so this lopsided bear, if you like, was because one of the coalition partners was more powerful than the other. Now, what about the three ribs in the mouth? Obviously, if this bear has been killing other animals or other beasts and it's eaten them, these three bones in its mouth, what do you think they'd represent? Obviously other beasts or kingdoms that this particular beast has conquered and eaten. Does that make sense? And that would fit really, really nicely because history tells us the Medo-Persians conquered westward. They went to Lydia. They conquered Babylon in 539. That was the end of the Babylonian Empire. And then they went towards the south and they conquered Egypt. 3 areas they conquered. And that would tie up very nicely with the 3 ribs that God put in this prophecy. Now, if we jump to Daniel chapter 8 for a second, you'll see some very interesting parallels. Here's another couple of animals brought to view, and you'll see how this parallels chapter 7 really nicely. Here in chapter 8, Daniel is given a vision. He says, "I saw in a vision a ram which had 2 horns, but the one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing," and notice the 3 ways it's pushing, westward and northward and southward, so that no beasts might stand before him. So here comes this ram with 2 horns, and one horn's bigger than the other, and it's pushing 3 ways, north, south, and west. And as he's watching, as I was considering, behold, a goat, a he-goat, came from the west. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler, that means anger, against him, and smote him, or hit the ram, and brake his two horns. So what's this talking about? We don't have to guess, because in chapter 8, Daniel is given the explanation, and we'll have a look at that right now. You come to later on in the chapter 8, and it's spelled out plainly to him. No guessing here. He's told, the ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Greece. Do you see that? He's told quite plainly what these animals represent. The ram is Media Persia, and the goat is Greece. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation. Now, can you see some parallels here? Again, the principle the Bible repeats and enlarges. It gives more detail. So in chapter 7, we had this bear. One side was raised up of the bear more than the other, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth. You come to chapter 8, and here's this ram. It's pushing in 3 directions. It has 2 horns, and one of those horns is higher than the other. Can you see parallels here? Essentially, and we're told quite plainly that this ram is Media Persia. It tells us that in chapter 8. So can you see the parallels here? The bear and the ram are the same power. They've got the same characteristics. And we can see the same thing here. The goat in chapter 8, we're told, was Greece. And it came from the west, didn't even touch the ground, it says. It was literally flying, moving so rapidly. And it had 4 horns. When that one horn got broken, 4 came up. And what do we see with this leopard? It has 4 wings. If 2 wings means it goes fast, what does 4 wings mean? It's like it's turbocharged. Does that make sense? Twice as quick. And so it flies very fast, and it had 4 heads. Just as when this horn was broken, 4 horns came up, this animal has 4 heads. So can you see the parallels here? Logically then, who's this beast then? If that's Greece, who do you think that is? Obviously it's the same power. Does that make sense? So this leopard with 4 heads, with 4 wings, that goes really fast, symbolized by Greece. And that first horn out of the goat symbolized Alexander the Great. And when he died, his kingdom was broken up. So I'll put to you that Greece is symbolized in chapter 7 by these leopards. The 4 heads are the 4 kingdoms which the kingdom broken up into. Now the wings, meaning speed, history tells us that Alexander conquered very rapidly. Here's a quote from a typical history book. In the short space of 8 years, Alexander had annexed an area of little less than 2 million square miles. Talks about the amazing rapidity of his conquests. He conquered so rapidly, it was unbelievable. And when he died, his kingdom, after all the toing and froing between the generals, settled down into 4 of these generals took over 4 parts of this empire. And these are the names: Lysimachus, Seleucus, Ptolemy, and Cassander. So just as that leopard had 4 heads, and after the horn on the goat was broken, 4 horns came up, history tells us 4 generals took over the Greek Empire when it broke up. What about this last beast, this dreadful, terrible one, strong exceedingly, with iron teeth, and it had 10 horns? What do you think that represents? Yes, the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. So the Bible tells us, here's this kingdom represented by this beast, and 10 kings will arise out of this kingdom. And again, we go back to history. What happened when the Roman Empire broke up? These 10 tribes came down and literally broke up the Roman Empire. So out of that Roman Empire, 10 kings arose, controlling 10 parts of it. And we know some of the nations are still there today: English, French, Swiss, etc. Some of them are gone, and we'll look at that a little bit in detail, more on another night. So can you see the parallels here? Daniel chapter 2, you've got the gold, silver, brass, iron, and then it breaks up. What do we find in chapter 7? You've got a lion, which is a perfect symbol of Babylon, just as Babylon was known for its gold. Can you see the parallels? The bear, representing Medo-Persia, raised up on one side. Who came after Medo-Persia? It was Greece, symbolized here in chapter 7 by the leopard. The iron legs and iron teeth of this thing was the iron monarchy of Rome. Can you see all the parallels? And just as this didn't come into a fifth kingdom, but it sort of got divided here, and you could almost say there's 10 toes there, what happened out of this beast? 10 horns come up. Can you see the parallels there? I'll put to you that chapter 7 is merely repeating chapter 2 and enlarging, giving more detail. Now, is this understanding radical or new? Did we just dream this up this morning? The answer is no. This has been known for hundreds of years, and I'll illustrate that. This is well documented. If you go to Germany, to Nuremberg. Nuremberg was a famous place where they had the trials after World War II. You know, the Nazi generals were tried there. And here at the town hall in Nuremberg, there's some interesting carvings. We'll have a look at that. This is the town hall. It was originally built in the 1300s, 1332 to 1340, and then it was revamped between 1616 and 1622. In fact, you can see the plaque. Here's the architect, Jacob Wolf. Between 1616 and 1622, they revamped this Nuremberg town hall. And here it is here today. And what's intriguing is some of these carvings or statues above the doorways. You can see there's carvings over the doorways. I'd like to share some of them with you. There we are, there you can see. Very ornately done, beautifully carved. A lot of detail. They don't go to so much detail these days, do they, when they put buildings up? But have a look at some of these. Notice on the left here. Let's have a close-up of that. Here is a lion, but this is no ordinary lion. Can you see what this is? It's a wing. Can you see that? There's a lion with wings. And next to it is a statue of a Babylonian soldier. Intriguing. And on the opposite side of the doorway, we find here, what do you think that is there? It's a bear. And notice what's in his mouth. Can you count them? 1, 2, 3. There's 3 ribs in his mouth. Where does that come from? That's straight out of Daniel chapter 7. And what have they got next to this bear? They've got a Persian soldier. Now here's another doorway. A different doorway. You find here, a bit hard to see, but can you see the 4 heads of a leopard? There's the mouth, there's one head there, there's one there, one there, one there. There's a 4-headed leopard. Can you see that? And he's next to does that look familiar to you? A Greek soldier. And on the opposite side, here's this, whatever this is, this strange beast. And he's next to a Roman soldier. Can you see that? Notice on the head of this beast here. Count how many horns it's got. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It's got 11 horns. Interesting. And one of them, you'll notice, has a funny little hat on it. What is this all about? Well, let's go back to the Bible and see where this comes from. Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. He says, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them... I'm sorry. Came up among them another little horn. I do apologise again. I'll get over this. That's better. Right. Another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. Do you notice that? Notice that very carefully. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. So here comes this little horn coming up amongst those other 10 horns, and 3 of those first horns were plucked up by the roots. Intriguing. Here's more details. Concerning the horns, there was another little horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and mouth speaking pompous words, it says in one translation. This is the Antichrist power. Now have a look at the clues the Bible gives. It's interesting, the Bible gives more clues, more details, more verses dedicated to this little horn than all of the other beasts we just read about. The Bible really focuses and gives us a lot of detail about this little horn that comes up. Daniel says, then I would know the truth of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth, and spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. What else did this little horn do? I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them. Wow, what is this little horn? Here's the explanation given. The 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse or different from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. Now what does all this mean? Sounds a bit complex. There's a lot of detail given here, more detail for this little horn than any of the other beasts we've just looked at. So this is more significant than Babylon or Medo-Persia or Greece or Rome. Who's this little horn? There's a whole lot of clues we can get to. If we look at what the Bible says and compare with history, what we've just looked at, you can tell a lot of things about this little horn. And this is so important. We're going to spend an evening on this because it's vital. God wants us to know who this little horn is. So we're going to put that on hold for now. We're going to continue this next Tuesday because this is a vital thing. God has spent so much time, so much detail telling us all about this little horn. It's important, I think, that we know who it is. So we're going to look at that next week. Just to wrap up, if you want some DVDs, we've still got some of those left. If we've run out, we can easily get more of those, which covers all the things we're going to talk about, including Noah's Ark, which is coming up. We're going to talk about this on Thursday and other places. Where is Noah's Ark? Does it exist? Did it exist? Was there a flood? And where is Noah's Ark? On Sunday, we're going to go to Turkey, to Cappadocia. And here, in this area, are underground cities, whole cities underground. We'll show you some pictures of those. And we're going to talk about being buried alive. Intriguing. We'll look at that on Sunday. Also next week, we're going to talk about the Ark of the Covenant. Also coming up is the United States and Bible prophecy. And how does that relate to what's happening around the world? What about the mark of the beast as well? Can we learn from the Bible what the mark of the beast is? So these are some of the things that are going to be coming up as we go further into the Bible through Bible prophecy.
Thank you all for joining us to join the dots tonight. We didn't get to see one of the sites in the Middle East. In fact, we took a closer look at some Old Testament prophecies. And I'm just amazed at how God reveals things to us. He could just tell us plainly, but instead He gives us these incredible images of beasts and of statues and of combat as well between a ram and a goat. This is just mind-blowing. And while the pictures, do throw us off a little, let's remember that they're here to symbolize things for us and to really communicate special messages. But to wrap up tonight, I thought we could just check out a few more questions, okay? Just to see how well we listened again. And so here's the first one. What animal symbolizes Babylon's power, as we saw tonight? Yeah, James. So a lion, yeah, with wings. Well, that's what we saw in Daniel chapter 7, definitely. And when we looked at some of the places which were used in Babylon, actually a lion was used quite commonly. So it most definitely was a lion. And there are some Bible verses which really confirm that for us. Second question. What shall the divided kingdoms of iron and clay, remember on the statue in Daniel 2, they look like iron and baked clay. What shall they never be able to do? They'll never be able to be united, eh? In fact, the text actually tells us to cleave to one another. They'll never be able to perfectly bind together. Okay, and we can see that today, can't we? Just amazing. God says this hundreds of years in advance, and while it has been attempted to be done, it still wasn't able to happen because of those 5 words that God told us there. Third question. Who does the rough goat represent? We saw a rough goat there with a large horn in Daniel chapter 8. Who does that represent? Alexander the Great, right? That's what it told us there. It told us it's that king of Grecia, which when we join the dots, it really can't mean anyone else but Alexander the Great. So incredible. This military leader, this king of Grecia, it's shown right here in the Bible. And as Ross was sharing, God doesn't just give us the story plainly. In one chapter, in chapter 2, he gives us an overview. Then in chapter 7, he gives us a few more details of those parts. And then in chapter 8, he gives us an even closer look at a few of those sections. And it's just amazing to see how he doesn't want to just give us the answer straight away. He wants us to discover his plan for this world. And he wants us to join the dots so that we don't miss out on the party, on that rock kingdom that's going to fall. A few Bible verses to wrap up with to really link this in together. Amos 3 and verse 7. Surely the Lord God does nothing unless he reveals his secret to his servants, the prophets. So God doesn't do anything unless he first reveals what's going to happen. And how does he do that here? Through his prophets. He does it through prophecy. And we know that the answer, as we saw last week, is really found in seeing how Jesus is the center. And as we stay tuned and check out what a few more of these prophecies mean, we'll see that the answer, the revealed answer behind these secrets is still Jesus, but we need to find the answers through prophecy. So I wonder if you're still wanting to see what God is calling us to see as well. If you're still wanting to unravel these secrets that he's wanting us to see in our lives. And if that's the case, I invite you to keep coming back and checking out these amazing discoveries. He tells us as well, believe in the Lord your God and you shall be established. If you believe in him, your life will be established, eh? Furthermore, believe his prophets and you shall prosper. So the true prosperity comes when we're willing to take a closer look into prophecy. And that's not so we can be superstitious about what's happening with the world. It's so that we can put a thumb on where God is leading us and how really amazingly he's revealing his secrets to us. So with that in mind, I invite you to come back on Thursday if you're able to join us. And hey, why not even invite a friend along if you think it might be worth checking out. But thank you for being here. And why don't we stand together and we can pray together before we head home. Let's pray. Loving Lord, it's been great to join some dots from the book of Daniel tonight. And as we have heard, as we have seen what you are calling us to understand, we just pray that it will make special meaning in our hearts as well. And even as we leave here, please guide us safely home and bring us back on Thursday if it's your will. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.